Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam President. I come to the floor again to urge an end to the Trump shutdown, which is over a month old, the longest in history. Let's be clear, this is the Trump shutdown. The president called for a shutdown 24 times, and he said he'd be proud to own it. Regrettably, it is clear that he does not care about the impact his shutdown is having on families across the United States. He barely acknowledges their pain. If you needed any reminder of the low regard the president has for the federal workforce, remember that on December 28th, in the midst of the shutdown, he instigated. He signed an executive order that will freeze pay for the civilian workforce in 2019, assuming he ever reopens the government. With his announcement on Saturday, the president is now playing games with the lives of hundreds of thousands of refugees and dreamers who, because of his earlier actions, could face the real threat of deportation. Meanwhile, his administration is playing favorites, rewarding those with deep pockets and good connections, forcing IRS employees back to work without pay to process tax returns, reopening the Department of Interior to help pave the way for oil and gas leases. For those without resources, it's often a different story. Recipients of federal housing assistance, for example, are wondering what their status might be in the next month. FBI agents are worried about the effect the shutdown will have on active investigations. Air traffic controllers, FAA inspectors, and TSA officers are working long hours to keep flights on time and safe, but the cost to them and their agencies will stretch years into the future. Transit agencies, unable to draw down needed federal capital and operating funding, are also feeling the pinch, which could affect service and safety down the line. We've seen this coming. That is why Democrats have been pleading with the majority leader for weeks to allow a vote on the funding bills that Senate Republicans wrote last year so we can reopen the government. These measures have broad bipartisan support. In fact, the leader voted for each of them. But for weeks, the majority leader refused to allow a vote on these and other bills, saying the Senate will not waste floor time on show votes, on bills he believes the president will not sign. By his definition, we can only bring up bills that can pass the House, earn 60 votes in the Senate, and get the president's signature. But as the leader knows, when there is a veto-proof majority, as there has been in the Senate on these very bills to fund the government, the president is, quite frankly, irrelevant. Here's what the record shows. Last year, the Senate passed the Agriculture Appropriations Bill 92-6. We passed the Interior Appropriations Bill 92-6. We passed the Financial Services General Government Appropriations Bill 92-6. We passed the Transportation HUD Appropriations Bill 92-6. And all they didn't come to the floor, the Appropriations Committee passed the Commerce, Justice, Science Bill and the State Foreign Operations Bill unanimously. As for the Department of Homeland Security, we passed a continuing resolution in the Senate unanimously last year to keep the department funded at least temporarily. There is no reason we can't pass that measure again and start paying our Coast Guardsmen and other DHS personnel. But what cannot pass is President Trump's demands for billions and billions to build hundreds of miles of ineffective wall through places where it is unwarranted. Don't take my word for it. Listen to Congressman Will Hurd, a Texas Republican, who represents the district he says includes 820 miles of the roughly 1,900-mile border with Mexico. Congressman Hurd has called a wall, quote, the most expensive and least effective way to secure the border. He is correct. And MIT engineers and other experts have estimated this wall will cost well north of $30+ billion. Democrats want to focus on border security infrastructure, but the improvements of greatest need, including ports of entry, and more effective technology to detect illegal border crossings and drug smuggling. Once the government is open, there is room for debate on how best to improve border security, and even on long-standing immigration matters. It won't be easy. First, The president's call for a wall is as political as the day is long. He's focused on motivating the roughly 30% of Americans who think keeping the government shut down is a good thing. Second, negotiating with the president has proved a difficult job, even for members of his own party, because he has a hard time keeping his end of the bargain. In December, when Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate unanimously passed a bipartisan deal sponsored by the Majority Leader to keep the government funded until the beginning of February. The clear understanding was that the president, as communicated by Vice President Pence, would sign the legislation, but within hours, the president scuttled the agreement. Going back to March 2018, the president nearly vetoed the Republican omnibus appropriations bill that was based on funding levels he had already agreed to. As far as funding for border security, the president changes his demands constantly. First, Mexico was going to pay for the president's border wall. Last February, he asked taxpayers for $1.6 billion. Then it became $5 billion. Now it's $5.7 billion. How is it possible to make a deal with such, frankly, an unreliable partner? But here's one other point, and it goes beyond President Trump. If Congress capitulates to his demands because he has shut down the government, he will be emboldened to use the same tactic again and again and again. And if he succeeds, then every president who follows will feel justified in using the same ploy. Rather than ending one shutdown, we will be inviting more in the future. The only choice we have in Congress is to pass the bills we know have overwhelming bipartisan support and reopening the government with or without the president's signature. Tomorrow, the Majority Leader will be asking the Senate to surrender to the president's cynical demands for wall funding. That proposal is a dead letter, purposely filled with poison pills. It will not get 60 votes in the Senate, and it will not pass the House. It fails the very test the Majority Leader has been saying must be met. It is, by his own definition, a show vote. As an alternative, the Senate will have the opportunity to vote again on the Majority Leader's proposal from last December, which would reopen the government through February 8th. Added to that measure will be much-needed disaster assistance. It will be interesting to see if the Senate Republicans will support or oppose this measure, which is essentially the one they wrote. I hope they will take yes for an answer and vote with all of us to reopen the government and to begin serious, thoughtful, and principled discussions on ways we can improve border security and many other topics. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.